Vincent, I want to personally thank you for coming to Short the TV to participate in this interview. You're teaching a lot of graduate classes in NYU. You have trained thousands of people over the years. And I just want you to share your personal experience. What do you do about yourself with our audience?
What I try to do is I try to give people a mindset. And the analogy I like to use is if you imagine a cannon. If you change a cannon by an inch, it changes the trajectory of a cannonball by a mile. So a mindset is something that could change in an instant. So yes, there are many tactical things to learn, but those things change as the externalities of our world change. But if I could give the people I coach, my students, executives, just that different mindset, then they'll be able to adjust to those externalities as they change throughout the year. So it's just a subtle change in perspective on how to view a different type of problems. And it's really about asking great questions. It's not about giving the answers, because if you ask a great question, that's when you get great answers. And of course, leadership is all about asking the great questions as opposed to giving the answers.
Why did you get into the teaching in the first place? Why teaching?
Sure. Well, I felt that I was always a teacher regardless, but as I'm a teacher, I'm also a learner. So there's a duality. I've never been strictly in a teaching mode, and I learned just as much from my students. But I had always been mentoring and coaching others, including subordinates or even as a business advisor to executives. So teaching really was not a jump to a new field. It was more of a natural progression, perhaps formalizing what I had already been doing. And of course, it's just very rewarding to be able to pass something on and also to learn equally from the students. I don't have any hubris about what I do. And I tell my students that your obligation is to be skeptical of everything that I teach you. And you should push back. Because if you push back, I will do one of two things. I will either be forced to refine my argument and be a better teacher, or I might perhaps change my mind and say that you offered me a new perspective. I never looked at it that way before. I think I'm inclined to agree with you. So I tell my students that the teacher does not have the answer. I have simply a point of view. And the way for me to continually refine my point of view is to make sure that the students receive it with healthy skepticism until all of us together as a group refine the argument until we carve everything and we have that perfect pearl of wisdom. And that only happens by constantly refining the argument, the same way a sculptor would continually chisel out a stone until I have that perfect, beautiful sculpture.
Can you tell us what are the different types of courses you teach? What's your expertise?
Sure. I teach business strategy and ethics, financial management, human resources, global human resources. I also teach a capstone course where we use a sophisticated software. It's a complex algorithm where students run a $100 million company competing against other students and other teams where they're actually running their own business. So that would be the capstone course where they're taking everything that they've learned in the previous courses right before they graduate. I've also taught merger and acquisition, organizational behavior, advanced staffing, and recruitment. So I teach many of the core courses in the program.
What I was fascinated by that you worked in 9 different countries. So you have international experience. So what I wanted to find out, how your international experience helped you to shape your understanding about HR.
It helped me understand that there's not only one view. And it helped me understand that my view is simply my view, and also it's going to be constantly in flux. What I've learned is very self-evident is that different countries view their policies and work practices out of their culture. So I like to avoid the mistake of trying to be endocentric and enforcing the corporate culture on the local subsidiaries. And good international HR is bringing the best out of every subsidiary and being polycentric, where every subsidiary in every country is able to form their policies and work practices where they can aspire to be as productive as they can be. But then there's a step beyond polycentric. We go endocentric, polycentric, there's geocentric. And geocentric HR is the difference between being a global company and an international company. For example, there's a difference between being a global company and just having offices all around the world. And that might be analogous to polycentric, which is still an improvement of an all roads lead to Rome endocentric company. But in a geocentric company, it's analogous to shared services or the economic concept of comparative advantage, where each country will perform for every other subsidiary the task that they perform the most efficiently. So for example, you might have a global company with 37 subsidiaries in 37 different countries, but you may run your global IT out of Singapore. Now your best IT in that moment might be in Silicon Valley, and your least expensive IT might be in another country, let's say Thailand. But if you look at the quality of IT against the cost of labor for those services, in my example, Singapore might offer the best comparative advantage. So a geocentric company is where you might run accounts payable out of Philippines for the whole office. And it's a different worldview because global companies are used to having the corporate office run everything, and they might be willing to have every country run their own, but to have, let's say, a local subsidiary run accounts payable, including for the US global office, it's a different mindset. But that's truly HR at its most global when it forms a geocentric company.
How do you define HR?
I defined HR as dealing with the last field of competitive advantage, because truly people are the last field of competitive advantage. Maybe 50, 60, 70 years ago, companies competed on who had the best machines. If you look at the Ford Motor Company in the 1930s, 1940s, the assembly lines, God forbid a man was injured, the people were interchangeable. And what made companies great all those years ago was who had the best machines, the best assets, the most capital. Let's fast forward to a call center. It's completely reversed. If you look at a call center, the machines are completely interchangeable. Facebook, Twitter, Google, they're not successful because they have the best machines. They're not successful because they have the best computers. It's really the people that they're competing against. So as we go from the industrial to the service to the knowledge economy, people are truly the last field of competitive advantage. So for me, HR really is the business of business. There's nothing left after people. I believe that there's a difference between transactional and tactical HR, which is the HR that many people practice. But if you want to get into strategic HR, you need both the breadth of business literacy, strategy, technology, finance. Strategy, what are you going to do? Technology, how are you going to do it? Finance, how are you going to pay for it? And how are you going to measure its success? So if you view HR through the breadth of business literacy, you have the breadth of business, but then you need the depth. You need that subject matter expertise. So I like to say that CEOs are no longer looking for HR professionals. What they're looking for are business professionals with subject matter expertise in HR. Let's talk about the progression of the discipline. Every supervisor, line management, wears an HR hat just by virtue of managing other people. So years ago, HR would handle all of the tactical and transactional functions, but the internet has really brought distributive input. So years ago, if you were to move and change your address, you would fill out a form and give it to HR, and then HR would put it in the system. That's duplicate process data redundancy. The data exists in two different places. But now through distributive input and the power of the internet, the owners of the data are responsible for putting it in. So now a supervisor would put in the raises and performance appraisal for their subordinates. So the HR department no longer has the tactical responsibility because the whole curve has moved up. So what I'd like to say is that every supervisor, just by virtue of managing people, now performs the HR functions that HR may have performed within their own department perhaps 20, 25 years ago. So what's left for HR today? The strategy. I want you to imagine a movie. You need 3 people to create a movie, the writer, producer, director. And they may split the majority of the profits. And then at the end of the movie, you might see 1,000 credits. The hairdresser, the gaffer, the best boy, the gentleman that holds the boom mic. Those are the people involved in the tactical approach. Now, both are necessary. But if you notice, most of the movie is created because of the writer, producer, director that share in the majority of the profits, and then the 1,000 names that come after the movie might share 10, 20% of the profits. So what's happening is for HR to really be effective, they now have to be part of the opening credits, writer, producer, director. And another reason why that phenomenon is taking place is because companies with globalization no longer have the resources to absorb HR as a cost center. What they're now demanding is HR be a profit center. And you're not a profit center if you're doing all those tactical and transactional HR functions, which have now been pushed down to line management through distributive input.
Vincent, how did you get into HR in the first place? Why you're so passionate about HR?
It was a deliberate decision. I love people, I love business, and I thought that HR provided the qualitative aspects of business with the quantitative functions of business. Many people might say, well, they joined HR because they want to help people. And I believe that's a faulty premise, because businesses are in the business of net income. But I believe that that net income is only possible with people who are the last field of competitive advantage. So I thought it would be the perfect blend of the qualitative and the quantitative of business.
What is your own HR philosophy? Can you explain it for our audience?
I believe the mantra might be, it's not good HR, it's good business, which makes it good HR. One time I had successfully executed an HR initiative, and the CEO said, that's good HR. And I said, no, 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 it's good business, and that's what makes it good HR. So it's really understanding that HR serves the shareholders, and it serves the function of increasing shareholder value. My other philosophy of HR is that I feel it's going towards the minister without portfolio. And I'll give you an example. In Commonwealth countries, we have the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Defense, but we also have the minister without portfolio. Not a sinecure position, they have veto power, they have a vote, and what the minister without portfolio is responsible for is making sure all the other ministers work together. Now, as we have computers becoming more powerful, algorithms becoming more intelligent, any task that could be completed by a set defined rules, no matter how complex, are gradually being taken over by algorithms. So what's happening is that HR is going to approach the space where any problem that does not neatly fall within the marketing department or the IT department, any problem does not neatly fall in one specific department but overlaps, I believe will eventually become the responsibility of HR. And whether or not they call it the minister without portfolio, I believe it's going in that direction, because all of the tactical and transactional HR functions are being made redundant by automation or sometimes outsourced, and the jobs are being completely hollowed out. I see HR as the second most important job in the company, second to the CEO. I think of the principal, the assistant principal, the CEO, the assistant CEO. And also my other philosophy talks about how HR is the department with the most balanced agenda, because the IT VP, for example, or the CTO cares deeply about the employees in his department, as he or she should. But HR is the one department where I'm tasked with being the employee advocate for all the employees, certainly not merely the HR people within my own department. So I could become the most trusted business advisor because my department is seen as having the most balanced agenda.
How do you measure learning outcome? What metrics would you look at?
Sure. Well, I look at pro forma income statements, because I don't want any HR professional to execute any HR initiative unless they execute a pro forma income statement. I don't want them to say, well, I decreased turnover by 20%. Well, that doesn't mean anything, because you may have kept 20% of low performers. And you might say, well, I've decreased turnover by 20%, and we've saved $100,000 as a result. Well, it's only when you take an income statement and you create a pro forma income statement and you measure, well, what is the impact of that HR initiative on net income? How do you both forecast the impact on net income, and then how do you compare what you forecasted to the actual? I believe the ultimate metric is the same metric that the CEO, the board of directors, and the shareholders care about. You want to measure it against its impact on net income, which really takes everything into account.
Your own HR philosophy, have you tested it in the private sector, and how it's been perceived by the private sector
Sure.
over the last few years?
People that I've coached, many of my students are professionals themselves that are trying to revamp their credentials. So for me, the ultimate lagging indicator in success is not how a student performs in the classroom. In fact, I tell my students that I'm not interested in their academic success, I'm interested in their professional success. So when I receive a testimony from a student or someone that I coach saying that they got a job specifically because of something that we all learned together in one of my classrooms, then that's how I measure success. I believe the job of any executive coach, and I believe the job of HR or any teacher in offering any professional degree, is to monetize the education. It's not about the letter grade, it's how can I monetize what I learn. So I receive many emails and correspondences from students, often bosses of students contact me and say, we have tuition remission. One of my employees is in your class and she told me about this wonderful thing that she learned, and now we're doing it throughout the department. So it has been received well because it's very pragmatic. It's focused on how do you monetize what you learned, and ultimately we see net income as the ultimate lagging indicator.
What makes a great teacher?
I believe empathy. I believe being able to try to understand what it is that the student is feeling. I tell my students that 20 years from now, you may not remember my name, you may not remember what I taught you, but you will certainly remember how I made you feel. Emotional memory is one of the most powerful memories that we have. So what makes a great teacher is empathy. And I tell my students that I'm not only concerned on what I teach them, but I'm concerned on how what I teach them makes them feel. And I will check in with them and I'll say, how are you feeling? I just taught you this concept. How is it sitting with you? How does it make you feel? So besides empathy, what makes a great teacher is a customer service mentality. Often students will come to me very upset. They had a child who was sick. They had to work late hours for a boss, and they're upset because they can't make a class. They might miss an assignment. And I tell them that what you really need to hear is that the problem is solved. Now, I don't know how I'm going to solve the problem because we're not there yet, but the first thing that they need to hear is that regardless of how we solve it, consider the problem solved. And once they know that, they're put at ease, and then they're able to receive everything else. So if you have a customer-student mentality and you reject the notion of an unequal distribution of power between teacher and student, but you really see them as your customer that you serve, that's my cannon changing by an inch. And it changes the trajectory of my cannonball by a mile. So because a teacher views a student as their customer, it changes everything, how they interact and how they're going to respond to those students.
Where do you see the future of HR profession going?
I see the tactical transactional aspect of HR now being everyone's business, regardless of what title that they hold. Even if you're an individual contributor, how do you manage yourself? And I see ultimately the profession going towards, as I mentioned before, the ministered out portfolio. If you look at the knowledge economy, Facebook, Twitter, Google, what do they really own? Well, they don't really own a lot of assets. Yes, they own buildings, they own computers, paper clips, and desks, but that's not what pushes up the market cap. If you look at the gap between a company's assets and the market capitalization, and if you look at the S&P 500 since its inception, I believe in 1956, you will see that gap constantly widening. I believe in the first 20 minutes of the opening bell when Facebook went public, its market cap exceeded what it took many companies traditionally 20, 30, 40 years to achieve. So HR is really becoming the business of business. When an individual can create a huge market cap simply by writing an algorithm in his dorm room, it's no longer about having to organize tools and machines. It's really about the marketplace of ideas. And as long as that comes from people, to me, companies are going to live and die simply on people. If I define HR the way the C-level does, you mentioned Jack Welch, HR becomes even more important compared to the ways many HR people define their own profession. Because ultimately, people are the last field of competitive advantage. So I see HR going again towards the ministerial portfolio, where it will be the second most important job in the company, second to the CEO. If you look at the equation for economic growth, it's workforce times financial capital times productivity. Those three multiplies equals growth. That's how countries measure their growth. That's how a company can measure their growth. But if you look at those three multipliers, HR owns 100% of the workforce. They don't own any of the financial capital. We say the CFO owns that. But if you look at productivity, I would say that the CTO, through the technology he or she brings in, owns about half. But the other half of productivity is about job design. It's about how do you organize the culture of the company. It's about how are your recruitment tools refined so you're bringing in the top salespeople. So I might say that we own half of the productivity multiplier and certainly 100% of the workforce multiplier. So if I look at the equation of economic growth, workforce times financial capital times productivity, HR owns 50% of that. And that's where the profession is going, that we finally recognize what has always been true. And what makes these facts beyond dispute is that I'm not defining HR in a self-referential HR paradigm. I'm defining it through a business paradigm. So eventually, I believe the profession will get that, and those that don't, those companies through natural selection will simply no longer exist.
How can we solve
Sure.
that skill gap problem?
Well, I'd like to talk about the Singapore model. There's a Singaporean economist that said, we in Singapore live in a grass hut. We feel every change in temperature, every shift in the wind. But you Americans live in a huge brick insulated home, and you don't feel the wind, you don't feel the weather. So in Singapore, as a result, we're constantly forced to adapt. If you look at the Singaporean educational system, they constantly redefine their K through 12 curriculum based on the job skills that are going to be needed 10 years out. Singapore is a country with very few natural resources, so they have become a talent factory. So one reason that we have the skill gap is that many Americans live in that huge brick insulated house. Since the 1970s, real wages against inflation have been declining, but it's only been discussed in the late 90s and certainly in 2008 with the economic crisis. But because Americans were tapping equity from their homes, the illusion was that America was still prospering, but this decrease in real wages has been happening since the 70s, but because it's such a huge, powerful country, many people did not realize. So I believe the skill gap, in part, is because I believe Jack Welch also gave the quote to paraphrase that one of the most dangerous things for a company is its success. So I think it has to do with Americans being so successful, being in that brick insulated house, that they didn't make the adjustments necessary when they should. So I tell people that America is a great country, it's a wonderful country, but for our careers, let's be more like Singapore, constantly adapting. The problem also exists because of resiliency. I believe that the more we could train our young people to be resilient, the less we're going to have that skill gap. Resiliency really is about how do we adapt to these externalities? How do we take accountability for our own decisions? And I think the people that are the most resilient, they confront the harsh realities that the global economy has changed. Give you an example. Right now, 1 in 7 people qualify for food stamps. Now, 20, 30 years ago, I might say to that person, don't worry, the economy is going to improve, but the Dow is at an all-time high. Frankly, the economy has already improved, and 1 out of 7 people qualify for food stamps in this country. So what that says is that there has been permanent structural changes in the economy. And as you pointed out, there is a mismatch between supply and demand of labor. But by people being resilient, by having high self-efficacy, and realizing that they are empowered to seek out the skills that are needed, that's going to refine the gap. So in conclusion, we want to be more like Singapore. You know, we want to live in that grass hut where we feel every change in temperature and we're constantly adapting. And that means being a lifelong learner, which is part of it. And it's also being resilient, not being afraid to confront the realities and saying, you know what, here are the skills that are needed, here are the skills that are in demand, and what are my goals, or what do I need to do to achieve the goals to get those skills? At the end of the day, people have to feel empowered to do it themselves, because when you wait for other people, other institutions, or even the government to give you those skills, of course that has its role, but that's not nearly as empowering as confronting that question yourself. So it comes down to resiliency, self-efficacy, and mentally, let's move out of our brick insulated home, even if that's where we really live, and mentally, let's live in the grass hut. And every day ask the question, what do I need to learn today that is going to make me more valuable in the marketplace? The economy no longer cares how smart you are. The economy no longer cares who you know. The economy no longer cares what school you went to or your GPA. Here's what the economy cares about. What can you do for me? And that's why people need to take a very pragmatic approach and say, what can I do for the economy? That's the lagging indicator. And then work backwards. Start with the end in mind. What can I do for the economy? And then what skills do I need to pick up to execute that?
How can we improve the U.S. education system?
Okay. Well, they say that in America you need a college education to compete in the global workforce. Now, the reason why public school went to the 12th grade, it was based on the paradigm that you needed at least a high school education to compete in the workforce. The fact that we've already acknowledged as a nation that you need a college education, or even some type of vocational school to compete, but yet compulsory education entered the 12th grade. So if we truly believe that you need an education beyond the 12th grade just to be a productive member of society, well, that perhaps should be considered just as necessary as a high school education. Let's talk about a dollar for dollar tax credit. There are countries that understand that the more education its citizens receive, the more money they will make 5-10 years out, and the more taxes they're going to pay. So a dollar for dollar tax credit in the United States is really an investment in increasing our own tax base. So I believe having a dollar for dollar tax credit and even viewing education beyond the 12th grade compulsory, or at least having that mindset, is what's needed to compete. But again, it's only going to increase our own tax base. So I believe that as a nation, we should do that for very selfish reasons. It's not altruistic at all. It's really in the self-interest of the country. And also, you want to start with the end in mind, look at what skills are going to be needed, and then adjust your curriculum based on those skills. Right now, the educational system often is run like a command economy, where the curriculum is just set down. So we talked about people needing to be resilient. I believe that the educational system in its curriculum needs to be equally resilient.
What's your definition of learning? I see different people defining it differently. How do you define it?
I believe learning is the ability to view a problem from a different paradigm, from a different perspective, or from a different methodology. If you look at what all therapies have in common, it could be Freudian, could be Gestalt, what they have in common is they train people how to view an event through a different perspective. So I believe learning is that ability to view a problem, an issue, from a different perspective. There was a study where they had a control group and another group, and in the control group they named objects. They said, this is a remote control, this is a dog chew toy. Then at the other group they said, this could be a remote control, this could be a dog chew toy. And then the experimenter created a situation where the blackboard had to urgently be erased, and there was no eraser. Well, the group that was told that this could be a dog chew toy used that toy to improvise and erase the board. So they clearly viewed that dog toy from a different perspective. And again, that goes back to the cannon example. I believe learning is when you're able to shift that cannon just by an inch, but it changes the questions you ask, the things that you're going to read in the future, the people you're going to interact with, the decisions you make in an entirely different way. So in conclusion, for me, learning is the ability to view an issue from a different perspective.
How do you define right people?
in the business space, we're constantly confronted with employees that are tagged as poor performers. And I have a reputation that if I hear that there's a poor performer in another department, I will actually say, have him or her work for me. And I'm a little bit of a contrarian. Instead of only trying to work with the right people, I will sometimes go out of my way to find a poor performer in an entirely different department, and I'll say, let that person work with me. Because I tell my students that their failures reflect my own. So again, a little bit of a contrarian approach. Instead of just embracing the right people, I try to take people where they are, meet them where they are, and see if I can adapt my style to where they now become the right person. HR is very famous for trying to change people's behavior and characters. Now, therapists can barely do this. So, for example, I had an employee that constantly came in late. And I adjusted her schedule. Instead of 9 to 5, I said, make it 10 to 6. Well, she came on time for the first couple of weeks. And then gradually 10 o'clock became 10:15. And you know where the story goes. I adjusted the schedule a couple of times. And I finally said, what hubris? I'm trying to do what therapists cannot do. I'm trying to change someone's character. I'm trying to make her the right person. I defined her job in terms of the ultimate lagging indicator. Here is your management by objective. If you achieve these objectives, I don't care if you ever come to the office. And of course, I was questioned by the CEO, and I basically said, I've been put in a position to give marital advice, and I'm far from an expert, but a frequent thing I would say, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? So I told the C-level, do you want to be right or do you want to book revenue? Instead of trying to change the person to fit the job, which is really an impossible thing to do, let's change the job to fit the person. So often, not having the right person could be a function of job design, and how much easier is it for me to change the job design rather than change the person? So it's just a little different take on the right person.
If I want to locate the right people,
Sure.
what are the qualities that I would look for in order to make sure that I have a person have fundamental right attributes, so the chances of succeeding with that person is higher than a person who is missing those attributes?
I think there are certain fundamental attributes that have a greater likelihood of predicting success. I look for resiliency, because you're always going to have setbacks. In fact, the higher up you go in an organization, your job title really is problem solver, because you're no longer dealing with the routine. So I want a person to be resilient. I also want a person to really be self-aware, and that means being able to describe their own failures. I might ask someone, tell me about a failure that you have. And if they don't have any failures, well, that to me is a red flag that they're not trying hard enough. And if a person could be self-aware, void of hubris, and say, here is an endeavor that I failed, and here's what I learned from it, I believe that that person is going to be more adaptable to meeting the needs of the marketplace. Because I might hire the right person today, but that external marketplace is going to be different a year from now. If you look at the compression of time, I think the CD is becoming, or already has become, obsolete. It's only been in the marketplace about 27 years. So now products and services are becoming obsolete in a shorter and shorter time frame. So I can no longer look at my 5-year business plan, because a year from now I know it's going to look very different. So I can't guarantee that the skills that that person has is going to be required a year or two from now. But if that person is resilient, if that person is self-aware and they can describe a failure and what they learned from it, if that person understands the difference between business failure and personal failure, then I know that they're going to be nimble and flexible like a reed in the wind. And what I like to hear a person describe their job as creating shareholder value, regardless of what it takes. Instead of waiting for me to say, you need to be trained on this, that person on their own is self-aware to know, I see the marketplace changing, I want to pick up these skill sets or core competencies to adapt. An unsuccessful and a very successful person have one thing in common: 24 hours in a day. And I might say that we really want to train ourselves to work smart as opposed to merely working hard. So another thing that I look for is a person having the ability to constantly re-engineer their jobs, so a year from now they're doing it differently from how they started. Because we can't push out the 25th hour in a day. And I say that there's really no badge of honor in working 80 hours a day and ignoring the other important components of your life. In class, when I speak to my students and I do executive coaching, I will say that let's define our inner circle. Our inner circle starts with us and then the people that we care for. It could be a significant other, children, parents. And how do we protect our inner circle? Well, there are many components. There's emotionally, spiritually, intellectually. But another way that we need to protect our inner circle, again starting with us, is financially, with the ability to earn. So if I know someone is able to constantly re-engineer their job and do it better and adapt, then I know that they're self-motivated, that they're going to correct a problem before I even see it. So in conclusion, I'm looking for resiliency, self-awareness of failure. Often when I ask, well, tell me what some of your weaknesses are, many of us have been trained to have a weakness sound like a strength. And I believe that that shows that a person is not willing to be completely honest. And I think if we embrace our humanity, I would want someone to feel confident enough to be able to say, well, here's a weakness that I have, and perhaps here's what I'm doing to work on it. For someone to have no weaknesses, they're saying that they're good at everything, and that's analogous to someone saying everything is important. And when everything is important equally, nothing is important. So the ability to know their weakness, be self-aware, and also self-efficacy, the belief in themselves to adapt. I want people to understand that the formula that if I could be successful, I could be happy, is cognitively broken. And I'm also looking for people that understand that the real relationship is reversed. If I could be happy, regardless of my circumstance, I could be successful. If I hire someone like that, I know that they have a greater chance of achieving their goals because they're not waiting to achieve a specific goal to be happy, that they're using that happiness advantage to achieve that goal. Because if you wait for a goal achievement to be happy, we just move the goalpost the next day. And at the end of the day, Russell, all things being equal, I do believe that people want to work with people they enjoy. I believe that people want to be a part of something greater than themselves. So we've spoken before. We use the example of we have 3 bricklayers. And we ask one bricklayer, what are you doing? I'm making bricks. The second bricklayer says, I'm building a wall. The third bricklayer says, I'm building a cathedral. I want to hire the person that no matter what job they have in the organization, they get the task significance, that they understand, regardless of what they're doing, they're actually building a cathedral because they want to be a part of something greater than themselves. Then I don't really have to spend time monitoring that person's performance because they're passionate about what they're doing.
What do you think makes a good leader? If leaders are made or born?
I believe that it's nature and nurture. I do believe that there are people that are born with natural inclinations to lead, but without the right nurturing, they could wind up being terrible leaders. I think it's very Western to view things in a binary way. Are leaders born or are they made? But if you embrace the duality of things, I do honestly believe it's both. If you are born a leader and it's nurtured, I believe you have the potential to be a phenomenal leader. If you are born a leader and it's not nurtured, you may not be a great leader. And if you are not born with those hardwired traits, but you nurture it, I believe that you have the ability to lead. But I do believe it's both because we are born with some endemic gifts, but it doesn't mean that we're going to do something with them, or even that we embrace humanity to the extent where we want to do something with it. So I do believe that it's both, and I believe that it's our duty to ourselves and to society that if we feel that we've been born with certain abilities, that we want to nurture those abilities as much as possible. We talked about the comparative advantage of countries. We talked about the comparative advantage of subsidiaries in a global organization. Well, if I'm born with a specific trait that seems quite natural to me, that's my comparative advantage. So just because the United States has the comparative advantage of growing food doesn't mean that it will, although it should and does. So I think identifying those traits that we have, and we're even more obligated now to nurture them. I think what makes a great leader is being more transformational than transactional. I'll give you an example. When I've done executive coaching, and I will ask for the org chart of the person that I'm coaching, and I'll have the typical pyramid. And I'll take that org chart and I'll flip it upside down. So your org chart shows you at the bottom of the pyramid with all the people that you're supporting. You know, gestures, symbols, icons, they're very powerful. A great leader has humility, but humility is not about being self-deprecating. Humility is really about, if you look at what do all humble people have in common, it's how much esteem do they put on others. It's not being self-deprecating. It's bringing out the best in others and making others feel good about themselves, on giving others esteem. So when you view humility from that paradigm, humility becomes a very powerful trait in a leader because you're bringing out the best in other people.
Do you think people lead differently during the crisis,
Yes.
or they should lead differently?
A crisis is a disruptor. It means it's no longer business as usual. So the reason why leading during a crisis is differently is that you actually have to shift the organization into a different mode of thinking. You're no longer trying to get them to be better at what they do, but you're trying to get them to do things differently, because a crisis is the ultimate externality, the ultimate change in your external environment. So usually leaders try to make people do what they do even better, but because the crisis implies that the external environment changed, you need them to do something different. But what really should stay the same is that core value. Even if your strategy changes, because a crisis means that you have to revamp the direction of the organization, revamp the strategy. I believe during a crisis, a leader goes back to those core fundamental values that transcend any external change in the environment. So instead of talking about strategy during a crisis, you're more talking about the vision. And you mentioned 9/11 as an example. One of the things that the mayor at the time was talking about were the fundamental transcendent values of the American people. And you talk about all the crises that the American people went through: 2 world wars, depression, the Civil War going even back. So you're no longer talking about strategy, because after 9/11, your strategy had to change. So the leader during a crisis goes back to those core fundamental values that is the common thread regardless of what's happening out there. The leader during crisis gravitates towards talking about those absolutes that transcend any changes that are happening in the environment. And from those absolute core values, regardless of what they are, that's where that new strategy is built upon. I also believe that leading during a crisis is that the successful leader talks about the harsh realities. At the beginning, people just need to know, no matter how difficult it is to hear, what those truths are, because credibility is so important during a crisis. They talk about the fog of war, and one of the first casualties of any crisis is truth, and that's why there's so many rumors going around. So during a crisis, the leader has to embrace his credibility as the only currency that he or she could never afford to lose. So that becomes even more important.
Reading is so vital when it comes to developing your own learning plan. So my question to you is that why is reading important?
Reading is very important because that's how we assimilate new information in response to someone else's response to a change in the external environment. So you could either wait until that change happens to you and then try to figure it out from scratch, which is not practical, or you could read someone else's response to an external change that's going to eventually impact you anyway and give yourself a quicker time to market in having an appropriate response. So we talked about learning being natural. It's really how we adapt in a quick time-to-market way to the changes in the environment as a survival tool.
Somebody once said, the biggest thing about learning is how do you unlearn the thing that you have learned. So my question to you, how do you build a learning culture within an organization?
Well, I want to, pursuant to your point, I want to make it even more. You mentioned that companies that are successful don't unlearn the things that they may need to unlearn. A good technique is to embrace the idea that facts are stubborn things, and if leaders could decide upon 2 or perhaps 3 metrics that they define success. There was a leader that used to tell people how to do their job, and he realized, people approach the job differently. Let me just give everyone 3 different metrics, and people will find their own way, and as long as it's ethical, I don't care how you get to that way, but instead of trying to micromanage people, let me give them 3 metrics that are important to the success of the organization and let them find their own way. So if you have people with the organization so long that they're still doing things the own way, one powerful technique is that facts are stubborn things. Give them 2 or 3 metrics, quantifiable measurements, how you would define success, and have them measure it monthly, quarterly, whatever is appropriate, and then have them come to their own conclusion that doing things their old way is no longer yielding to the result that you want. The reason why people are able to languish and get away without changing is because that ultimate lagging indicator, that ultimate metric that could have been staring them in the face hasn't been articulated yet, and they will come to their own conclusion. And I want you to think about differentiating leading from lagging indicators. The lagging indicator for your organization might be net income, but you have other leading indicators. Revenue is certainly one, but it could be customer satisfaction is a leading indicator. But if I'm responsible for customer satisfaction in my department, even though it's your leading indicator to net income as the CEO, customer satisfaction is now my lagging indicator. So I have to find, well, what's the leading indicator to customer satisfaction and who's responsible for that? So if you give everyone a defined measurement tool, they will come to their own conclusions that they need to change. Because again, facts are stubborn things.
In order to make a company successful, and if you had to choose what's more important, is it cost, is it speed of execution, or is
I have a very specific opinion on that. I was dealing with an organization that had a new CEO, and the CEO came in talking about cost reduction. Now, there are 2 ways to make $1 of net income. Reduce costs by $1, increase revenue by $1. So this CEO came with all these cost reduction packages, and I said, you have no vision. Reducing cost is not sustainable. Now, I've had people come to me and say, well, we've reduced these costs because times are tough and these are inefficiencies in the organization. I said, well, when was it in vogue to absorb inefficiencies? I don't care how high the stock price is, how profitable is it, when was it in vogue to erode shareholder value and absorb the buffer of inefficiencies? If these things were inefficient, they should have been dealt with even when the organization was doing well. So for me, what's more important is increasing net income by increasing revenue by $1, not by decreasing cost. Because decreasing cost is not visionary. Decreasing cost over the long run is not sustainable. It becomes self-cannibalistic, where the organization starts to feed upon itself. Now, if you're reducing cost to increase net income, that's something that should be done through the good times and the bad times. But when a CEO focuses on reducing cost and not on increasing revenue, I say that CEO does not have a vision. When I've hired people and they want to increase net income by having layoffs, I could hire an intern to do that. Now we're talking about HR as a cost center, but it's much more sustainable, visionary to produce that $1 of net income by increasing revenue. So I was speaking to someone that's involved in real estate, and he came to the conclusion that he started to invest in more expensive real estate property, even though it put a squeeze on his cash flow, because he came to the correct conclusion that the more expensive the real estate and the more he has to charge for rent, the higher quality of people is he renting to, and they tend to make better tenants. So I feel that when you focus on revenue growth instead of cost reduction, that's what's sustainable. Because Russell, you're going to get to the point where you can't reduce costs even more. So it's definitely revenue. As far as reducing cost, you never want bloatedness. That's something that should not be dealt with just because times are tough. And you also talked about speed of execution. Another important trait of organizations, now you asked me, what do I look for when I want to hire someone? Well, let's say I'm looking to invest in a company. A trait that I look for is nimbleness. Nimbleness embraces several concepts. I'm going to give you an example. You know, up in northern Thailand, they play elephant polo. And they said, you know, the elephants are trained to follow the soccer ball. And every once in a while, the soccer ball goes into the stands, and then the person said casually to me, as you may realize, you cannot stop an elephant on a dime. Okay? So I'm looking for companies that are not like elephants, that can stop on a dime, can be nimble, and then go in a different direction. This is why Russell small cap companies, if you look at the Russell 2000 index compared to the S&P 500, over time, the Russell 2000 index outperforms the S&P 500. What does that say? Small cap companies outperform large cap companies, because what's endemic to small cap companies is that they're able to be nimble. Why are they nimble? Well, they have less resources, but they're able to outsmart, outmarket, out-execute larger companies because they know that any adverse result could possibly bankrupt them a lot quicker than a large cap company. So if you have a large company, just like I want to be more like Singapore in my career decisions, I want a large cap company to have the mentality of a small cap company and be nimble. So yes, they had plans, but sometimes companies have so much bureaucracy, so many procedures, that they're not able to be nimble. Even though they know what changes they have to be made, they get in their own way. Don't quote me, but I believe there was a department store that printed out their whole handbook on the back of a business card. And it said, use common sense. And that's what they gave to employees. It said, here's the company handbook. So you can imagine that organization is going to be very, very nimble, because while organizations and firms need rules and procedures to give some structure, what happens is over time, they become greater than the organization. And I tell people that the rules and procedures are meant to serve the organization, but what happens over time, sometimes it's the other way around, where the firm is paying heed to these rules. Why? Well, it's how we did them before. So the way for your company, many other companies, to be nimble is to realize that the handbook, the procedures, the rules are meant to serve the interests of the company, and have the ability to make the decision, as long as it's ethical and certainly legal, but when that no longer serves the organization. Because a lot of companies, like you described, Microsoft, they blow their time to market, not so much because they're bloated, but the rules and regulations slow everything down. And like that great handbook posted on the back of a business card, use common sense. That's a bit of an extreme, but I do believe that that company made a very powerful statement on the importance of being nimble.
When you have a startup culture where you make the decision faster, sometimes you don't have access to information and you don't have a lot of resources, and I believe the lack of resources drive innovation, frugality drive innovation.
Absolutely, constraints are our friends, and you have to be comfortable making a decision with 80% of the information, because 100% of the information, you'll blow your time to market. And that's why you want to develop a portfolio of risk. You're not looking for projects that have a 100% chance of success, because the return on investment is very low. And you want to develop a portfolio of risk where you're willing to make decisions based on 80% of the information, again, so you don't blow your time to market. And really understand the difference for your employees between personal failure and business failure. Business failure is when you identified a risk, you made the business decision that the risk was worth taking, but the risk actualized. You've identified the risk didn't happen. That's a business failure. A personal failure might be you didn't even identify the risk. So that's how I differentiate personal failure from business failure. And understand that as long as you have a portfolio of risk, it's okay for 2 or 3 out of those 10 initiatives not to succeed, Because remember, you can also harvest what did you learn from those failures to attach to the other 7 things that are going to succeed.
I see that a lot of times companies growing and growing, and after 10 to 15 years, the growth stalls. What could be the reason why the growth is stalling?
It's called the power curve. I'll spare you the calculus behind it, but a power curve is a curve, on an x and y axis as it arcs up, and then it gradually stalls. That's also called the Red Queen hypothesis. In Alice in Wonderland, the queen said, and I'm paraphrasing, but I run, and I merely stay in place. So that's the power curve where you eventually level off. And the reason why that happens is because the company is doing the same things that made them successful. There was one country that I was living in, and I did not want to move to another posting because I didn't want anything to change anymore. I said, you know what? I'm tired. I want to stay in this country. I'm tired of all this constant change. Well, what happened was, over a very short period of time, the people that I've come to know and love, they wound up moving. So even though I said, you know what, I'm not going to move out of this country because I don't want any more change, it changed anyway. So the reason why the Red Queen hypothesis or the power curve happens is because the company is doing the same thing that it does that made it successful, despite the fact, Russell, that the global externalities in their own SWOT analysis has changed. So you have to jumpstart that power curve by reinventing yourself. We look at IBM, they made hardware, they made computers, then they got into consulting. So they had that power curve, they stalled, but then they developed a new curve, they developed a new business. We've seen this with Xerox. So we see this constantly because what becomes a product differentiator over time, if you look at the product life cycle, becomes a commodity. It becomes commoditized. So clearly you have to develop new bells and whistles to rejuvenate your newfound commodity back to a product differentiator. But if you're doing what made you great to get there, that's why companies stall. And you really have to embrace the thing that hurts you, and that means change and abandoning the things that already made you successful. But just like I didn't want to move from that country because I wanted I wanted a more stable environment, that environment changed anyway. So I say it's going to happen anyway. So an abbot in a Buddhist monastery once told me, embrace the thing that hurts you. And it winds up hurting you less as a result.
Is the globalization and the improvement in technology that changes the way we hire people and way we manage our workforce?
Absolutely, and a lot of it has to do with the new demographic. If you look at millennials, the idea of having to physically come to work, well, first of all, that increases your SGA cost. If you look at universities, their biggest cost is real estate, not the expensive employees. So when you look at the high cost of real estate pushing up SGA cost, which every additional dollar you spend on real estate reduces net income by $1, plus with the new demographics of millennials not really embracing that environment, this change is happening anyway. You can either embrace it or not. Now, I want you to imagine, Russell, the last company that made 8-track tapes. As other companies were exiting the 8-track tape market, that company most likely had expanding market share, but in an overall shrinking market. So when you don't embrace change, you might be misled because in the short run, you might find yourself increase market share because everyone else is exiting that space. But eventually, the overall market share is going to decrease. Let me address, you talked about if you just hire people remotely, you can't embrace that culture. I was dealing with the issue of virtual teams and whether or not we had to fly everyone in to work together in a physical space, or can we have people work virtually? A piece of wisdom that I use for most of my decisions is a balanced approach. Studies have indicated that teams work very productively virtually if they meet perhaps every 6 to 8 weeks, just for a couple of days. So instead of having this Western binary approach, either we work remotely or they must come to the office, what about having a 2 to 3 week orientation, whether in the office, and then have some type of schedule, perhaps more off-site meetings, or have a schedule where people do come in, and that way one complements the other. That would be my response to this CEO, because you definitely limit your talent pipeline if you're forcing people to come in addition to increasing your SGA costs. So again, it's sometimes very Western to have an either-or binary approach, but a balanced approach is a very good piece of wisdom that I take to most of my decisions. Right now, information, because of especially the way fiber optics was overbuilt in the 90s, you can have an MRI taken in the United States and read in Bangalore, and the results given back the next day. So information could pass in an instant, right? But the value added is not the distance between Bangalore and the US, it's the distance between the computer monitor and my eye, which is connected to my brain. That's the real value added. So whether or not I'm doing that in the office or remotely, I think becomes less relevant if I really understand where the most value added is. However, if you look at the value add of collaboration, there is an argument to be made, and I do want to address people's concerns that if people are only working remotely, then collaboration, as a result, could suffer. And that's why I offer a hybrid approach where people are getting together, but that does not mean working side by side. Because Russell, if I'm working in your organization and I'm in the office next door, I'm not with you 8 hours a day. So there might be days in a row where you and I never see each other. So I don't need to physically be next door to be working side by side. That may or may not happen. So if you take a balanced approach and you have concepts such as hoteling, where people no longer own their office, they'll plug into their docking station, they'll work a few days a week. I think that's the best way to embrace the new demographics of millennials, reduce your SGA costs, and maximize collaboration. And studies have shown, Russell, that as you offer people more flexibility, you don't necessarily have to lead the market in terms of your comp plan. That flexibility and people being able to address the personal aspects of their life, that's worth money to them. So you don't always have to lead the market in terms of price points in your comp plan if you give people other things that are of equal value. In a top-down marketing approach, you invent your mousetrap, and then you convince people why they need that mousetrap. So you need a strong marketing team. In a bottom-up approach, you approach the market with nothing, you find an underserved niche, then you go back and you design your product or service, and then with a bottom-up marketing approach, people will gravitate towards you. What companies are doing now is that they have begun outsourcing the design. They have begun outsourcing the design of their product or service to the customer. To the customer. So what happens is, by the time you have your product, the marketing is already built in because you included your customers in the design. If you look at the way software is done, Google will put out a beta version, and then the customers of Google will work on that version and make it even better. So by the time Google releases that software, that product, well, the customer base is already built in because they were part of that design. And it's in the same way that training should be built into the design. The reason why an ATM machine is so easy to use and you don't need a manual is because training is built in the design. So in the same way, you don't want to build your mousetrap and then have your training and development people write the manual to do the mousetrap. Build training into the design. Analogous to that, Russell, consider building the design of your next product or service. Consider outsourcing that design to your core customers. And you'll find that not only will you be giving them more of what they demand because they helped in its design, but you might find yourself spending less SG&A cost on marketing because your customer base is built in. Companies do this through a variety of ways. People talked about help desks being outsourced from America to Bangalore, but now there's one better. Companies have their own blogs and bulletins where other experts, and let's say Microsoft, other customers are answering the questions of other Microsoft customers, and now they're pulling out the help desks in Bangalore. So companies are having their own clients answer the questions of other clients. So sometimes companies outsource the design of their product or service to their customers through having an interactive website. Sometimes it's inviting your core, most loyal customers to, let's say, an off-site, one-day seminar and find out, make your next product demand-driven. Like, what's the one training that you are not getting that you would take if it were served up to you, and what would that look like? Don't worry whether or not we can do it or not, but if you were to temporarily remove constraints, what would that look like? If you needed to learn one thing in the next year that you can't get out there, what would that look like? So by the time, when you outsource the design to your customers, by the time you design that product, right, as a bottom-up approach, you're spending less money on marketing. But keep in mind, I'm not saying marketing is less important than any other departments. I'm just saying that you're going to allocate those marketing dollars in a more efficient manner. I do want to conclude with this point. When you're coming up with a new product and service that is so revolutionary, you have to have a top-down approach. If Henry Ford asked people what they wanted, they would say, we would like horses that require less water and run faster. They could not imagine a horse carriage without a horse. So if you're coming up with something so revolutionary, I never knew until Steve Jobs invented the iPhone that I needed to touch glass and move icons. Now I need that, but I didn't realize I needed that until Steve Jobs told me that I needed that. So your most extreme innovations, of course you want that top-down approach, marketing approach, because you need to educate the customer that you don't want faster horses, you actually want a horse carriage without a horse. But that does not include everything. So think about outsourcing the design of your next product or service to your customer base, and find that your revenue is going to be locked in as a result.